There's definitely times during the game where, like, I was scared. There's no doubt about that.
Bring me back to that moment when you found out Corey was leaving.
It wasn't just Corey. I mean, we lost some heavy hitters, like, totally came out of left field. I don't think anybody was expecting it. Yeah, it was a shock. The way it ends, Kratos isn't dead, but I was trying to kill Kratos. They said you can't kill Kratos. That came down from Sony higher-ups. Probably the most stressful game I've ever worked on.
Was it worth it? Welcome to Artwell. I'm your host, Jacob Kelly, and today on the show, we are joined by Stig Asmussen. Stig worked on both God of War 1 and 2 before being named the director of God of War 3, after which he left Sony Santa Monica and joined Respawn Entertainment, where he directed both Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order and Star Wars Jedi Survivor. Before we get into today's interview, I want to remind you that if you haven't already, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. If you want even more from me, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter at the link in the show notes. And now, without further ado, I am very excited to present to you my interview with Stig Asmussen.
There are no breaks in this business. You make your breaks.
The reason I'm in this room right now is because my music's very dope.
Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later.
If you just truly love cinema with enough passion, then you can't help but make a good movie.
Break rules. Leave the world more interesting for your being here. Make good art.
Do you ever think about the fact that Kratos was almost named Stig? Like, there's a parallel universe where that exists?
Yeah, I think, I'm glad you asked that question. I think that one was kind of like, I talked about it in a previous interview, and I think it was kind of taken out of context, and it's no fault to whoever I was talking to about it. But there was, when we were working on the original God of War, one of the things that happens is you just kind of crowdsource for names because it's difficult to come up with them, whether it's the title of the game or names of characters or trophies. And I threw my hat in for a bunch of names. I think I probably had 5 or 6 names. And ultimately, the names went to our marketing group. And they kind of stress tested them. They might have actually taken them through focus tests. They didn't recognize the name Stig. So basically the list had, I had maybe 5 names, but it said, Stig at the top. And they thought that was one of the names. And they really liked it. So somehow that became one of the finalists. And, obviously we weren't going to use that. But I'd never really had a chance, but it was a kind of a silly story of something that happened on that first game.
And so, you didn't end up in God of War. You did end up in another game. And I was wondering if you could tell me the significance of PNK 666.
Where did you find this out? It's crazy. And that's a good story too, because it's kind of got a sad ending. Now I was working on this game, Gauntlet Dark Legacy. It was an arcade game. It was one of the last arcade games ever made by Atari/Midway. And one of the things that Midway is known for is big head mode and being able to put, for arcade games, being able to put in codes. So the codes are set up so you can basically kind of save your progress and your stats. Very, very light save. And we also had it so you could unlock secret characters in the game. So PNK 666 was just a silly name that I came up with that was a punk rock version of me with a green mohawk and a chainsaw and a big head, of course. And it was pretty cool because I actually I think it was on the second or third date with my wife. We were in San Francisco and we walked by an arcade and the machine was there. And I said, "Hey, do you want to go play a game?" And I threw in a couple of quarters and I put the code in and she couldn't believe it. But here we are, maybe, I don't know, maybe a couple of years ago, my son and I were in Santa Cruz and we went to the boardwalk there and they had an arcade with a ton of old machines. And we tried the code out and it didn't work there. And the reason why is because they're not real old machines. They're all just, they're emulators with they're not even using, if you look at them closely, they're not even using CRTs. The cabinets aren't legit. So a lot of that stuff has been wiped from the emulation. But yeah, that's kind of the background on that.
Can you tell me about the first time you saw your name on the internet?
I didn't actually see it. My dad reached out to me and he said that he did a Google search for me. And I think it came up with credits for that Gauntlet game. So I didn't even realize it was up there. At the time, I think I had seen my name in print, actually, on magazines like Game Informer and Next Gen. But, actually, maybe I didn't even see my name in print that early. The games that I had worked with or worked on were definitely in print. But that was the first time, and I looked it up, and it was pretty cool because and that was probably about, I don't know, 2002, 2003, and like nobody in my family, like if you searched them, nothing would come up. So my dad was at the time was a distinguished engineer at Michigan State University. So I think he was probably looking up his name and nothing came up when he found mine.
Your dad was an engineer. Your grandpa was an engineer as well, right? He came over in the 1920s, I believe.
Yep.
Was it tough to not be an engineer, to continue that generational engineering trend?
Well, my stepdad was a mechanical engineer, and my dad was an electrical engineer. They both worked at the same school. That at the same time, they were both department chairmen of the different departments. My brother, like I said, became he currently is an electrical engineer. Yeah, it's definitely an engineering family. I really dislike math. But the funny thing is, like, when I first got into games, is there was actually a lot of math involved in 3D modeling and geometry, and I had a better understanding of it than I was giving myself credit for. But it was about kind of like doing simple equations in my head, based on just, going through the motions of doing the same things every single day and trying to find faster ways of doing them.
I want to jump ahead here to God of War 3. I was wondering if you could bring me back to that moment when you found out Corey was leaving, and like what was going through your mind at that moment.
Totally came out of left field. I don't think anybody was expecting it. Yeah, it was a shock. I remember I was sitting at my desk doing work like every other day, and maybe I was like reviewing work with somebody else. I was an art director at the time, and he's like, I'm out of here. And we had a big open at that time, Santa Monica, and I believe it still is. They're in a different building, but it was a big open studio plan. And he was on the other side of it. Everybody could hear him, and everybody just stopped what they were doing. And he walked out and he shook a couple people's hands. I believe he shook my hand. I sat right next to the exit to the back parking lot, and that's where he was parked. And yeah, it was never the same after that. I mean, I don't think people really understood what was going on because we had no idea what the inner workings were of the situation at the time. I mean, I think I had a little bit of knowledge, but like, nobody thought he was going to leave, and I think people were shocked, and then the shock turned into like, this certain degree of like fear.
I know the story goes then that they were looking for the next director internally, and you submitted a few names, not including your own, but ultimately ended up getting the job as director. When they offered it to you, did you feel ready for the challenge at that point in time?
Well, I think I felt like I was ready, but I didn't know that I necessarily wanted to do it. I really enjoyed being an art director. And the good thing about that is at the time, which is things have changed since then, and it wasn't very sustainable, but I was able to manage it. I think I had like 50 or 60 people reporting to me. Like I had all of art, all of animation, all of VFX. And of course we had a really big team because it's an art heavy game. And because I was able to, and plus I worked really closely with design as art director. And, I was able to build a lot of really good connections with people. And I had outside of the director and maybe the lead engineer, I probably had the best visibility on like the entire project, and probably the design lead as well too, because he's a good friend of mine, Todd Pappy. He was one of the people that was being considered as well too. But it was just kind of like, I was really happy being an art director, and I wasn't sure that I wanted to change that. And they asked me, I think a few times, and I think finally the third time I said, I'll do it. And that was based on, having a couple weeks of no director. And we did kind of like this director by committee where the lead producer, the lead designer, and myself as the art director were kind of making decisions collectively, and which is a really difficult thing to do with the way that team is structured. A lot of teams can succeed at that because they've honed it into a well-oiled machine that everybody understands. And I started to think, man, if I don't do it, like maybe I won't even want to be an art director here anymore. You know, like what's the other, I mean, and there was a ton of support. Like that's why they kept on asking me, is people kept on saying, we think Stig should do it. And the more I got that recognition and that validation, the more I thought about, you know, it's not sustainable the way that we're doing things right now. It made the decision a lot easier for me. I mean, I won't say it was easy, but, that's the most important thing, is having the support of the team, because, you know, you're going in there and you're doing something that you've never done before. You've watched, you know, I had a lot of experience, like standing right next to Corey while Corey was making decisions and offering my, you know, suggestions to help them form those decisions. But now it was all up to me. And, you know, getting back to the support, you know, when you got the support of the team and you're very honest with them, I was always like, look, I'm going to make mistakes. And, but I'll promise you one thing, I'm not going to shoot from the hip. If I don't know an answer to something, I'm going to say, I don't know, but I'm going to try to find an answer and get back to you. And if I still don't have an answer, we'll figure it out together. And, you know, just trying to build, you know, find my groove as a director, and a big part of that was just, you know, honest and just mutual respect.
Do you think part of the magic at Santa Monica is the fact that there is an individual kind of at the helm? Like, so there's some studios where they can kind of do director by committee a little bit, but it feels like, at least from the outside perspective, that each God of War game is so heavily influenced by the personality of the individual at the helm. And so do you think that's part of what makes part of the magic and the secret sauce, I guess, at Santa Monica?
Absolutely. No doubt. I think that, like I said, that's the way that studio is built. And, you know, you have to be able to, making a game like that on where the expectations are so much, they're so high, and the quality bar is so, sometimes it feels like it's out of reach. You have to be able to make decisions, and you can't get, you know, mired down and you know, grinding to a halt because multiple people can't make decisions collectively. So yeah, I think that on the flip side of it is oftentimes the director only serves as director once, because there's a lot of pressure that comes with that, and it grinds the individual down. But I also think, though, that it gave a certain like flair and personal flavor to each game that lets them kind of stand out on their own.
And so how did you go about kind of carving out your own path as director? Like when you make that decision, like what does day one look like? How do you start kind of steering the ship in a slightly different direction to make it a little bit more personal to you?
The first thing that we had to do was when one person, it wasn't just Corey. I mean, I believe at that time, Eric Williams left as well. And maybe not too long after Shannon left. I mean, we lost some heavy hitters, so that was the first thing, is kind of like reshuffling and reorganizing and getting people into positions where we felt and they felt like they could succeed. And then it was looking at what we had and the time that was left, and, you know, making decisions. Are we going to, you know, I think at the time there was, you know, we can't extend the project. I mean, that was a long time ago. I mean, maybe a lot of it was just kind of like trying to map out what the next several years were going to be like, completely aside from the creative. But at the same time, we had to keep on moving, because I think we probably had, you know, maybe 125, 150 people that needed work to do. They needed to be fed. So we worked on the creative as well too. And that was like, I had a pretty good idea of where Corey was going with the story. But there was a lot of elements. It's like, how are these things tracking that we're trying to do? And to a certain degree, I felt like I needed to tweak it quite a bit, because I had to, you know, be invested in it. And, I'd expect anybody would do the same thing if I were to leave. So we made some adjustments, and I started to kind of hit my stride of what my approach to directing was going to be like. And one of the things that I find, and I still do today, is, I try to lead by example, but also, make sure people have as much ownership into what they're working on, and act as more of a supportive director. One that's here's kind of the macro vision that what we're going for, but everybody's going to kind of have a piece in that, and I'm going to help steer and guide to make sure all those pieces kind of hit that macro, and the macro will become a micro, and then we're eventually going to ship. Yeah, a lot of it was defining the big moments that we're going to do in the game. That's always important for God of War games. What are the footsteps that Kratos is taking, figuring those out, where all the locations that he's going to go, that are, born out of the conflict, and ultimately, what's the end resolution.
Talk to me about that macro and micro vision, what your vision is versus the team's. How do you, I think it'd be difficult to have this vision, because I know, at least at the time, you used to have to be able to play the whole game in your head. So you had a very good idea of what this game was supposed to look like. How do you kind of allow the team to bring ideas that might be just as good, but different from your original vision? How do you kind of balance those two things?
It's a lot of it is you have to put your ego aside. People might have ideas that are, like you said, just as good. A lot of times they'll have ideas that were way better. And then you got to just say, well, we're going to do it your way. And it still fits. And, or it might mean that we have to do some other adjustments, down the road, in other areas. But again, it's I try to create a box, and I'm pretty strict that we don't go outside of that box. But if we stay within that box, then, and I learned a lot of this when I was art directing as well too. It's if I wanted something to be red and somebody was making it green, and they really wanted it to be green, I would force myself to have a really good reason to make it red, other than I like red better. There's things that are definitely subjective. So a lot, it's a lot of it is about swallowing your own pride in an effort to give people the ownership, give people the autonomy, so that they're just as invested as you are. And at the end of the day, that equals, I found that equals magic, and everybody's, excited, and they want to get it done, and they want to see it through.
Can you give me an example of the box you're trying to put people in? Is it a filter almost? All decisions can be run through? I believe on 3, it was redefining scale in video games was kind of something I saw in one of the early press events. Was that something that all decisions need to be run through that filter, and as long as they can track back to that, it fits? Or what is an example of the box?
Yeah, so that would be, redefining scale would be something that we would consider, this is a pillar component for this game that we're working on. And we might have, maybe 4 or 5 of those. And those things are basically sacred. And they're sacred until you find out, we were able to redefine scale. We were able to make the Titans, and that was incredibly difficult. And there were times that we considered, is this a pillar that's worth it? Is this a pillar that we're just going to throw out? But we kept on pushing on it, because sometimes you get so deep into it and relying on that pillar that there's no turning back. But defining the criteria that's within the box, there's a couple components to that. The first is what's the design, what is the desired reaction that we want from the player? What is obviously we want, for God of War 3, we wanted the player's jaw to drop to the floor, and then we wanted them to pick it back up, and then we wanted it to drop again and again and again. And it happens there's a rhythm to it. It happens almost the entire game. That's kind of the reaction that we wanted from the player. It's what's the art? What are we going for? In terms of defining the artistic vision that we have. On that game, there was a lot of it was technical, because we were going to a new console. So there was a huge leap in fidelity. I was just actually looking at God of War 3 the other day. My son played it actually not too long ago as well too. And it's still a stunner. It's amazing how good that game looks. So that was another one of the big pieces of criteria, is from a technical standpoint. Then, for a game like that, it's all about your wow moments. It's about the story. The story is, I think, is one of the things that's a little bit. It's the easiest. You're never done with it until you're done with the game. Essentially, it's the easiest thing to kind of like. It's the easiest and hardest thing to kind of like rewire and massage and polish and make better. And in some cases, add new things when you realize you're missing something. There's major gaps or plot holes. They come in really late. And then, like obviously what are the new gameplay pillars, like features and everything like that we want to explore. We had a bunch of new stances in God of War 3. Those are all the key ingredients that go into like the box of criteria.
One thing I will say too, in terms of like it still being a stunner.
One more. I'm sorry.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
Can all this fit in a production? I mean, this is huge, and I can't believe I forgot it. And can it all fit within the production confines of the resources that we have as all of us as teammates?
Well, on that note though, and coming to talking about Titans, actually, I have this quote from Tim Moss here, and he said it wouldn't be God of War if we didn't do something we didn't think we could do when we started.
Yeah.
And so, how important? Kind of on that note, then I guess. Do you use fear as a bit of a guiding light almost? Like if we're afraid of the idea, that means it's something we should be running towards and trying to accomplish?
No, I wouldn't say you use fear. It's more about like, don't fear failure more than anything else. I mean, like we're going to try something, we're going to continue trying it, and it's not going to work, and we're going to try again, and it's not going to work, but we're going to learn each time. So it's that, I mean, if you there's definitely times during the game where like I was scared shitless. There's no doubt about that. It was arguably, I would say God of War 2 is probably the most stressful game I've ever worked on. More so than 3, but 3 was pretty stressful. But yeah, I would never be a champion of using fear to motivate people.
Not necessarily to motivate people essentially, but almost like using it as like the gut check of are we playing it too safe essentially? Like, are we thinking big enough? It was kind of like, not necessarily to motivate the team, but more so as like a filter to run your decisions through. I
think a better way to put that, and it was something that like I'd often hear out of the design department, was go big or go home.
And like, I mean, you guys did.
Yeah. I mean, it's a minor miracle that like, I mean, with any game, it's a minor miracle at the end when you play it. I remember with God of War 3, there's a point that I played it and it's like, it wasn't crashing all the time. Pretty much everything was in there. And I'm like, this is really good, and it's like, that's the best feeling in the world. And I'm so grateful to like been able to, have that feeling so many times in my game, in my career. I mean, on God of War 1, it was amazing. Just the whole time I was playing that game, I felt like there's nothing out there right now that I'm playing that's anywhere near as good as this game, and nobody knows about it. Completely under the radar. And I remember bringing like professional like dev kits home and hooking it up to my like home theater setup, and people would come by, and I wasn't supposed to show them the game, but like we'd have like kind of like that verbal NDA moment, and it would just blow people's minds away. The Hydra moment at the beginning. I mean, there was nothing like that. And it turns out there was another really good game that year, and that was Resident Evil 4. So it's such a pleasure to get to that point where it's coming together and it's going to be magical.
Do you ever look back and think about, I believe Resident Evil 1 was like a seminal gaming moment for you, because you grew up as like a big horror movie fan and a gaming fan, and that was like the first one that brought both those two things together. Do you ever sit and think about how cool the Stig playing Resident Evil 1 would think it is that you made a game that was in the same conversation as Resident Evil 4?
Oh, yeah. Definitely. And I mean, it happened again last year. They remade Resident Evil 4 and Survivor came out. But Resident Evil 1 was, yeah, I mean, that was, I remember reading magazines and waiting for months for that game to come out. And I mean, another big game that was Kingsfield and Kingsfield 2. And now those were the original, like kind of like From Software games that all the Souls games like kind of mean, I know that anybody remembers those games, but like they're like first person like Souls games, and you know, just having the experience and being able to play that stuff, and the fact that that still resonates, that the core, the guts of those types of games still resonate with players is awesome.
Do other games still scare you? Like I know Uncharted 2 when you're making God of War 3, or even back to God of War 1 with Game Devs May Cry. Do games still scare you as much when you're in the development process as they once did?
Oh yeah, for sure. It's different though, because I'm a lot more, until I get my hands on them, I'm a lot more skeptical about previews that I see, or you know, any kind of promotional material put out by marketing. I'm way more skeptical than I was back then. But they don't scare me the same way. I mean, I think I've got enough experience now that I can look at something and I can kind of break it down a lot faster than I once could. I mean, things that kind of seemed like sorcery at one point, it's easier to kind of like, at least also talk about it with my teammates and everything, and learn from it as well too.
Can you still enjoy games the same way you once did, or is that director brain always on where you're trying to figure out how they did everything they did in the game?
If it's a game that's very different than something that I'm making, yeah, I can have a lot of fun with it. But when it's something that is close to kind of my wheelhouse, that's where it's definitely, I'm grinding the whole time that I'm playing the game. Wheels are turning. But, you know, if I'm playing something like Stardew Valley, even though there's a lot in there that's so cool that could be applied to something that I would make, it's so different that I can just like completely get lost and enjoy it.
I want to jump back to something you talked about earlier with creating these jaw-dropping moments.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the Hydra from God of War 1. I think you have perfected the art of the opening level. I think like when I just think of God of War 3, I think of Fallen Order, I think of Survivor, like each of those three levels to me are just like mind-blowing each time for different reasons.
Thank you.
What are some of the things, when you sit down and you're thinking about creating the opening to a game, like what are some of the important criteria you're thinking about?
The opening level, it's interesting. There's ways that you can kind of grade. You can grade like kind of these, what we call wow moments. A wow moment can be something that's sheer spectacle that people just can't believe that they're taking part in, that they're playing a game and they're actually engaged and controlling the character that's on the screen. That's one example. There's another example that you can do that it's something that's more emotional impact. So that would be like, you know, the couple of spoilers, the Cal and BD moment in Ilum on Jedi Fallen Order, or like Seer's death and Survivor. But at the beginning of the game, the most important thing is that you grab the player's attention and you don't let go. And it's difficult because at the same time, you're training people. So you have to, and you have to assume that like a lot of people, I mean, you want people to be playing, and you want to, you know, refresh the people that are already fans and have played before. So it's actually kind of difficult coming up with pacing where you've got people, you've got their attention, and there's like kind of a cadence to how you're doling out like all the control sequences and everything, so it doesn't feel like you're learning. It's a fine balancing act, but at the end of the day, it's all about doing something that's striking, whether it's like pure spectacle or it's emotional, or ideally it's a combination of everything. Like a good example of that would be like The Last of Us 1.
In terms of like these big high spectacle moments, kind of the inverse of that is like these little details. And I feel like that's something I see in the three games you've directed, is just these like small details are almost given as much of an emphasis as the big details as well. And I'm curious why sometimes small details people will never even see are given such a high focus.
Can you give me an example of a small detail?
I remember I was watching a making of, this is for God of War 3, and someone was talking about like the amount of time they spent working on one crate. Like just a crate that's going to go in the background of a level.
Well, I mean, we set a bar that everything in the game is going to look stunning, and but there is that earlier in my career, I had to work on being more confident in approving things. So there were cases, and I think that would go for the person that was the art director at the time as well too. We're all, we're not completely sure with every decision that we're making. So there might be cases where somebody's iterated on something 3 times and it was probably good enough on the second iteration. So there's some of that falls on me, but the other is that we're making a game that millions of people are going to see. We want all the pieces to feel authentic and cohesive. So if there's one piece that can ruin that, it's basically the weak link and everything falls apart. So we have to make sure that we're setting the bar very high. And I think that's when I think about AAA games like the ones that Santa Monica makes and what we're doing at Respawn, and it's all about having like this very high bar, this standard of excellence, and everybody's kind of feeding off of each other. And some of it might be, the artist that was working on the crate, it might have been their decisions as well too. Like they were basically, talking to the people that like they were working with directly, and or looking over their shoulder, and they're saying that that person over there is doing something I can learn from, and that's pretty stunning, and I want to make mine a little bit better. And there's actually a lot of it. There's a lot as a leader or as a a director or a manager. Sometimes people, like I remember an artist was working on a doorknob I couldn't believe it after like I saw that this artist working on a doorknob for like over a month, and I remember going to the art director and I'm like, this person's been working on a doorknob for a month now. Oh, they're doing other stuff. And I'm like, doorknob can be done in a day. I don't want to see that up on the monitor anymore. And so we're all feeding into like this goal of trying to make the best thing ever.
I think that was to the example of the crate. I think it was the artist themselves was trying. Like it was their own internal bar that they were striving for. I don't think they were asked to do iterations. But then when you have all these little things that you can dig into, how do you determine what to prioritize? I wrote down this quote of yours where it says, there's no limit to good ideas, but there is a limit to how many of those good ideas you can implement. So like, how do you decide what actually gets the time and attention?
It's a difficult question of, you kind of do it on the fly to a certain extent. I mean, there's a lot of it is kind of like, what are we get back to the criteria and the major goals for the game, and those trump everything, right? And those get more attention than everything. But then there's things that are like, if they're easy wins and they get in the game quickly, a lot of times people, they do a lot of initiative and they get something that would take several other steps through different departments to get in the game, and they just figure it out and they get it in themselves. Things that surprise you. All the time I'd be playing the game and I'm like, where did this come from? Where did this come? I mean, especially like as the games get bigger. I mean, I feel like in the God of War games, I kind of knew every square inch. But like on Survivor, it's like, there's all sorts of stuff in that game that I still don't even know about.
Talk to me about that a little bit. About like, I think that's part of like the magic of gaming, especially now, is like every single person will have a slightly different experience. And I was listening to a spoiler cast you did, and I didn't even know that the Rancor was in Survivor. I didn't know Boba Fett was in Survivor. And so like, why put those things as optional moments?
It's totally intentional. I mean, it's the same. It's about that mystery. It's about that fact that like you're gonna engage with the game and you're gonna find things that I'm not gonna find, and it's gonna be something to talk about. And through that engagement, then you might go back and start playing the game again. And it's all about keeping the player curious and on their toes, because ultimately that's what it's all about. That's why you're playing the game. You're playing the game because you are curious and you want to find out what it's all about. And some people want to, they want to be completionists. So packing it with as much as possible. I mean, I would say when we approach the game, we approach it, this is the main quest, and this is all the other stuff that we're going to do. And this portion of it is going to support the main quest, and this portion of it is going to kind of live on its own. Yeah, I mean, the Boba Fett cameo was something that we wanted to reward the people that decided to go down that path. And we thought that was pretty cool because they went through a series of challenges that deserved a cool kind of like gift for it.
And like proof is in the pudding. Like I want to go back now and find that Rancor fight. And just to be clear, like the reason I just mainlined both games because I've spent the last like 5 months playing all the God of Wars straight through. And so when you said yes, I was like, I need to make sure I spend the time. So for the last like 2-3 weeks, I spent nothing but my time on those Jedi games, just trying to mainline through both of them, just so I had the context for this conversation. But I will go back. I'm going to find the Rancor. I'm going to find Boba Fett. But I do think that is cool where it's like it creates these moments that it's like rewarding the curiosity. And like I just think that's such a cool aspect of gaming you don't get in any other art form.
Yeah, I mean, I should ask you the question when you play games. Are you able to stop working? Are you working while you're playing games?
Lately, it's been a lot of working. Yeah, that's a great question. And it's like something that's like I need to play a game just for the sake of it. And like technically playing the God of Wars it was a decision I made. I was like, I want to really dig into these games, so I'm going to play them. But then I was like, all the games I was playing was just God of War since like October. Whenever I had a minute, that's what I was playing. And I'd only ever played the first one like 10 years ago. And so it was really like a fresh new experience. It's like when you talk about that, like how 3 visually still holds up. Like I remember turning 3 on for the first time, just being blown away at like this was PS3 visuals. And it was like this game that I'd always like, I remember seeing them at Walmart growing up as a kid, or like the reviews coming out for God of War 3. And like, I was very aware of them, but I never actually devoted the time. So it was a really cool experience. And that jump from 2 to 3, I thought was just a huge leap, which was really cool. There was something I wanted to ask you about with God of War 3, actually, because I know it was like you, Todd Pappy, and Bruno, I believe, who did the dream sequence.
Yep.
I've heard you say that this was probably the moment you were the most stressed out on God of War 3, arguably, making this game, or making this level. Looking back on it now, was doing the time, those 2 a.m. mornings, driving home late, was it worth it to get that level in the game?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, it was totally worth it. I'm really proud of that moment. I'm proud of what, and there was more people involved as well too, but that was one of those situations at the end. There was a huge gap, and like we did not we put all this effort into this amazing game, and like the things that we were trying to do to resolve it in a real way that could have impact on the player, and that's beyond just more killing. Is to kind of reflect on that a little bit. And it was super late, and but we had to come up with an economical way that we could do it quickly, And I actually, it's funny is that wasn't that stressful for me because it was something that I had, since I was actually working on it, and I was in the level, I was, working on not only like the layout with Todd, but I was also working on the art. I did all the art in there, and like, of the lighting. I had 100% control over it. You know what I mean? Like a lot of times I'm stressed because I'm stressed about the things that I can't like actually roll up my sleeves and do. And so I could see, it's like, this is coming along. It actually came along a lot faster than I thought it was going to. But yeah, that was totally worth it. And it's still something that I point to in when I'm working on games now, and other people bring up as well.
What gives a game soul? Because I think the quote I found was somewhere that you felt before making the dream sequence, the game was good, but it had no soul. Like, what are things that give a game that? A game's got soul when it's hitting you emotionally and you're thinking about it and when I say emotional, it doesn't mean like it needs to have crying moments or anything like that. But you're thinking about it in an artistic way beyond, like, yeah, God of War it's a blast. It's a lot of fun. It's a popcorn game. When I'm talking about God of War 3, I mean, new God of Wars have a lot of soul, but it's when it has meaning, it's more than just a game. That's a really hard thing to kind of describe. It's something that
or like nail down a prescription for. I think more than anything, it's just, does it feel like something more than just a game? Is it something that transcends that? I guess that's the best I can answer that.
You know, you don't feel it, or you feel it when it's there, and you feel it when it's not as well, but it's just a feeling.
Yeah, you can't really describe it. I mean, I think a lot of it comes through the atmosphere. It comes through, just does it feel real? Does it feel authentic? And like, does it have its kind of its own vibe? Does it stick to that? Does it not feel random? I'm starting to discover some stuff right now that maybe I'm just programmed to do to a certain extent. But like, do all the pieces feel cohesive? And does it have a rhythm to it? I think if it does, and if that rhythm, if that cadence, that kind of tone stays consistent when it kind of bends in one direction or the other, it's evolving in a way that makes sense. I think that's kind of the sweet spot. That's where you got to land. But breaking that down into like what the components are is really difficult to do. And I think a lot of that comes down to like, the leadership of the game, like understanding like the vibe. A lot of that too, it's like illustrating like imagery and reference from other things, pulling all that together and saying it's part of this and a dash of that. And these are the things that we're going to focus on. But like, there's like tone that you're pulling from other places, and then you're adding your own kind of voice to that on top. Now, a lot of times it's really cool is when you're mixing different pieces, elements together, it creates something new that's special.
And that comes back to what we talked about earlier, where it's like having that one person at the helm who can kind of bring those tastes and influences, can guide the project in interesting directions. I was curious. So I think it was the God of War Game Directors Live. Dave Jaffe talked about calling you and begging you to change the ending of the game.
I don't remember that.
You don't remember that phone call?
I don't even remember that exchange. Like, what did I say in the moment?
I don't remember what you said. I think he was on like a longer tangent, and I don't think you got a chance to actually respond, which is why I was going to ask if you remember, like, how did like just the conviction of sticking to your ending when someone's trying to get you to change it. But if you don't remember that exchange, I'll just cut the question and I can ask something else.
I could try to surmise. It might have been because at one point of course, Kratos, the way it ends, Kratos isn't dead, but I was trying to kill Kratos. Maybe it had something to do with that, or that came down from Sony higher ups. They said you can't kill Kratos, and that's why we have the blood trail at the end. But that, to me, it was a little bit. It's like, we're just going to end this thing, and we're going to end it on a bang, and it's like, and that's going to be it. We're going to move on, and we're going to work on a new game.
And with the trilogy, I know you said that you like to think in trilogies, so that makes sense.
Yeah.
Is that one of the influences? Speaking of the fact you've gone on to work on Star Wars, but before that, you said that every game almost you've worked on up to that point had been influenced by Star Wars in some way.
Yeah.
I was curious if there's any other Star Wars influences you can point to in God of War 3.
Stuff that I haven't talked about before is just in general, like artistically, like the lighting, the way that Star Wars approaches lighting is, and I did a lot of lighting in those games, was always influencing how I approached like scenes. Like nighttime is never really black. It's like there's a certain amount of blue or green to it. That's like 70s, 80s movies, but like I think Star Wars definitely had a huge influence on that. You have the warm beacons that kind of like are the places that feel like inviting, and they also feel like places of safety. A lot of that, like I'm just talking about Dagobah right now, but it's. The funny thing is I can't even play, like you talked about playing the game through your head. I can't even play the God of War games through my head anymore. When my son played it, I don't know, 6 months ago or something, and I would pop in and watch a little bit here and there, and I'm like, man, I forgot about some of these sequences that are so cool. And like and it gets back to what you were saying, like there's those little details, the amount of effort and craftsmanship that goes into the smallest things that might be on the screen for 20 or 30 seconds, but you do that over and over again, player is definitely gonna to notice the level of quality and care that went into it.
Well, like you talked about too at Santa Monica, sometimes it felt like that the bar of quality was almost out of reach.
Because it's got to get higher with each game. It's testament to that studio that we were able to start that, but just everything that comes out of there is gold.
Does that having such a high internal bar almost make it hard to feel the external pressure? Like if you have such a high internal bar, either like personally or within the studio, does like pressure from fans and expectations from media and stuff not really break through as much just because you have such a high bar that you're striving for already?
I think definitely when you're at like a director level, you're thinking about both. But it helps that, you're always trying to, if you've got a good benchmark and you're only as good as the last thing that you did. And that bar was already really high and you're going to raise it and you're going to get above that. And that's pretty easy to judge. Then yeah, you're probably going to end up in a pretty good spot.
Bit of a random question, but can you tell me about the day Stan Lee came to the studio?
I was not there that day. I can't remember. I think it was either at a recording session or I remember I was pretty irritated about it at the time. Of like, because it was kind of random, and yeah, I could tell you people thought it was great when he was a really like friendly guy, and like they were able to glean a lot from him. So
that's good. I'm sorry that you weren't there to witness that. You said earlier how when it comes to getting close to the end of a game, the story's never done until the game ships.
Yep. God of War 3 is a great example of that, because we were just talking about like, the whole like in Kratos' head moment at the end.
And I know you even thought of a story piece for the ending, or a different ending, I believe, but it was too big to fit in from where you are in production.
Well, it involved a bigger boss fight, and then a lot of the stuff that we put into, and the boss fight was really complicated, and a lot of the stuff that that ended up getting filtered into the kind of headspace, like mindfuck sequence, was in a cinematic. And it turns out the fact that other part, the fact that it was too big and it was like a complicated boss fight, and we had to like basically pull that back, and we did something that was simpler, that was like a cinematic moment in your hands. It was a blessing in disguise, because it ended up turning out to be much better than what we originally had on paper.
I was going to ask that if sometimes when you're forced to make cuts, if that allows you to find solutions to problems you never would have found otherwise.
It happens all the time. And that's what, like you have good people that trust each other, working together. And, the thing is, at the end of the projects, you're like, everybody is in lockstep with each other. So you're making decisions, and you're solving problems like 100 times faster than you were earlier in the game. And it just becomes instinct. So yeah, it happens all the time. So, like, and sometimes it's like, we just want to get rid of this thing that this problem that we can't solve. And people have already come up with 10 different solutions. So we start talking about those, and yeah, they are better. And they're simpler and they're cleaner.
Talk to me about the idea of making them simpler, because I feel like simplicity is a key to being widely applicable to the masses. I think it was even when you first got the job with Santa Monica, God of War was pitched as Greek mythology on steroids.
Yeah.
So is simplicity important to be able to market a game to the masses?
Huge for marketing the masses. I mean, if you could have the deepest, richest lore that is so, like if you had like, a 3-part book series, it's so engrossing, so enriched and with great ideas. But if you can't like kind of describe that to somebody in a couple of sentences, it's going to be really hard to market it. I mean, obviously. So yeah, I think another one was God of War was like Greek mythology meets heavy metal. Both of those, like, yeah, I kind of get it. That's a really cool idea. It's like, Clash of the Titans beats heavy metal. And it's a video game. That mashup makes a lot of sense. So I think we see it all the time with games. Mashups are becoming big right now as well too.
You mentioned this a little bit earlier in terms of God of War always wanting to one-up itself. But I know since you were in art school, you've always been on a quest to constantly one-up yourself. Do you ever get to a place where you feel like you almost can't do that anymore?
Well, you have to. What I've done is I've calibrated my expectations. as you get older, it's a bigger picture. It's not making sure that each little thing that you do gets better than the last little thing. It's the collection of everything. So, and it's also just being, having the confidence of just simply taking pride in what you've done in the past and understanding that's pretty damn good. And like the next thing I do is going to be good, and maybe it's not going to be quite as good, but it's going to be different and it's going to be good too. So yeah, I certainly have changed in that regards. And I think that, in general, like my perspective on what's good has changed a lot as well.
My last question, because I know we're running out of time here. I have a quote of yours that says, I've been working with Kratos for 7 years. I've learned a lot. He's taught me a lot. What did you learn from Kratos?
Persistence. I think that's probably the biggest thing, is persistence.
Stig, this has been a lot of fun, man. I really appreciate you for taking time to come on the podcast. Before we jump off here, I know you're not talking about what's coming next, but if there's anything you can plug, I don't know if you have Instagram or Twitter or anything, but I want to give you the floor. If there's anything you have to plug, please.
I got nothing to plug. Nope.
All right, man. We'll just end it there. Thank you so much for the time.
Right on. Thank you.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed my interview with Stig, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. If you haven't already, go and check out my deep dive where I share with you everything I learned studying God of War. And if you want even more from me, you can subscribe to the Artwell newsletter at the link in the shoutouts. And now, go do your thing. And whatever it is, do it well.